Okay. Uh, so we've been talking about, if you remember, I said that research really went in three directions on intimacy starting in the late 70s. One, the product, what it is that you feel, the feeling of intimacy, and that is deep and abiding connection. Secondly, the process, genuinely known and received. And then the last one is places, where the places that you and I can build intimacy. And that's not like physical places, that's not places in the sense of different types of relationship, but domains of intimacy, even inside one relationship itself. So, this is a visual representation of the work of David Olson. Yes, yay, got the name right. David Olson, whose dissertation in the mid 70s was on different places where you can experience intimacy with your spouse. He actually created a test called the PAIR, P-A-I-R, Personal Assessment of Intimacy in Relationship is what it's called. And then, has anyone ever done the prepare slash enrich test? That's like a premarital or postmarital test. They're really popular with pastors and clergy, especially. You can go get prepare enrich certified. Have people take about 150 to 200 question survey. It takes about an hour to make it through, and then it basically feeds them information for how well coupled they are, strengths and weaknesses and whatever. David Olson is one of the key researchers and founders of the Prepare Enrich, and was based a lot upon the research that he did here on the different places that you can have intimacy. He nominated 6 places where you, or 6 different types of intimacy, 5 of which are represented up there: spiritual intimacy, physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy, and recreational intimacy. He also suggested there was a 6th type called aesthetic intimacy, that there's a certain sort of intimacy that you can have based on your desire for beauty, aesthetic beauty. There's a connection there. That one did not have a strong enough evidence to go forward, so they removed it. And then, because he was doing his research at a state university, University of Minnesota, they removed spiritual intimacy. Not because they were against it up front, but because they couldn't really get consensus on how to define it, because it was a secular, not a sacred school. If you can think about us trying to get together with multiple different types of Christian sects and then trying to say, hey, what does a charismatic think about spiritual intimacy? What does a reformed person think about spiritual intimacy? What's an Arminian think about spiritual intimacy? They would probably all have very different responses, which is exactly what they found. Nonetheless, that domain still had a high enough score to merit its inclusion. They just couldn't define it well. And then the other 4, physical and emotional, intellectual, and recreational, were also had high enough validity to merit inclusion in his study. Now, what I did, I came through this research material through 2 separate ways before it became my dissertation. First off, through my marriage and family therapy work. I became Prepare Enrich certified and had to do work, and you had to use the pair a certain number of times with a certain number of couples and work your way through all of that in order to go and get your license. And so did all of that work and was familiar with it. And then when I got my MDiv, my pastoral counseling professor talked about these same types of intimacy. And when he talked about it, I recognized that in my work, I had seen a sort of pattern. And so I said, I think there's a pattern of these various domains, and that's what you have here. Spiritual intimacy on the bottom, covering the base, that this is the most important type of intimacy, and that when it's high, it gives resilience to the others. We'll talk about that more here in a moment. And then The lower on that particular paradigm you get, the more vulnerable you are, and therefore the more connective it is, but also the highest for creating feelings of rejection and isolation. So when someone doesn't want recreational intimacy with you, it tends to hurt more and cause more isolation when someone doesn't handle a bid for emotional intimacy well. And the other thing that I found at the time, now I would say this has changed over the last 10 years. Um, the differences between gender differences between men and women when it comes to emotional and physical stuff has begun to wash out. And I don't know all the various things that are driving that, but it seems to be true. What I would have told you 10 years ago is that men tend to, and I would say at a 2/3 to 3/4 clip, find physical intimacy to be the most connective, and they often try to get physical intimacy via the route of recreational intimacy. Let's go do something fun together and hope we end up in bed together. Okay? And women tended to find the most connectional emotional intimacy. And they would often try to get emotional intimacy through the route of intellectual intimacy. Let's share ideas, because my husband's fine thinking about things and talking about what they think, and hope that we move into the heart, where we can talk about our hearts and what's going on inside. I don't know that that is always true anymore. I think that that pattern has begun to be more fuzzy, to be honest with you. I published an article on Desiring God, basically nominating this pattern, and it was the most well-regarded. It was the article of mine that went the most viral back in the day. And so that's why my dissertation was on intimacy, as I said, well, if this is what I'm going to be known for, and who wants to be known as the intimacy guy? I wrote an article because Desiring God said, you got anything? I'm like, sure, I can write on this. And then it became the thing that I was known for. I'm like, okay, Lord, I guess I'll be the intimacy guy. But I think the pattern that does hold is that spiritual intimacy gives resilience to the other four, and that emotional and physical intimacy, and especially physical sexual intimacy, are the more vulnerable and therefore have the highest ability to connect, but also the highest ability to cause isolation. Does that make sense? So now we're going to walk through all 5 of these domains together. Spiritual intimacy. Like I said, spiritual intimacy is the most foundational intimacy. If it's high, it adds resilience to the others. If low, then your relationship is like a house built on sand. Why is that? Well, because if you have high spiritual intimacy, you should be doing a number of things together. Number 1, you should be in the ordinary means of grace together. Ordinary means of grace, prayer, preaching, sacraments. Okay? And so you are consistently around fellow believers and the Spirit ordering the things that happen. Have you ever been at church and the pastor is preaching and it feels like he has been watching you at home? I remember when my wife and I first got into church together, early marrieds, every time we'd come home, we'd be like, is he recording us? Because he's talking about exactly the sort of things we struggle with. And that's what coming and worshiping does for you, is it's Holy Spirit led, but you've also got a bunch of other believers that are also trying to be the spouses that they're called to be. Not that society builds for them, but instead what Scripture tells them that they should be by way of husband and wife. And so when you are spiritually intimate, you have some guardrails so that as you begin to move in patterns of isolation, and every relationship moves in patterns of isolation because you're in a frustrated world that is sin sick. And so it's going to push you apart from one another. And so this should add some features that get you to see your own sin, confess regularly, and then try to live up to your call in order to be the spouse that you're called to be. Oftentimes when I'm premarital, we talk about spiritual intimacy and we talk about prayer. and we talk about praying for and with one another. And I will tell my premaritals, when I say pray for each other, I don't mean the prayer that you want to pray, which sounds like this: Dear Lord, please make my spouse the spouse I know I deserve. Instead, what I mean is, Dear Lord, please forgive me of all of my failings as a soul shepherd, and help me to live up to my call to steward and shepherd another soul in the way that you call me to be. And every time I fall down, and I will fall down again today for sure, have grace for me, and then allow that grace to impel me to be more like you and not help me to be less like you. So that's the sort of prayer that you're praying for. Again, that's kind of a guardrail. But it's more than just guardrails. There's actually something incredibly connective when we worship together, when we have similar trajectories of sanctification and growth. So again, you don't have to be doing the same devotional together. In fact, it's very few couples that I have found that can do the exact same devotional together. One of them, someone's doing a Tim Keller thing and someone's doing a Piper thing, or someone's doing a Puritan thing and somebody else is doing a whatever, men's Bible study, women's Bible study, something like that. It's fine. Because oftentimes your speed differs, how you appropriate the material differs, and you frustrate one another when you try to do it together. If you can do it together, that's best. That's awesome. But it's kind of like a good, better, best scenario. Type A's, you don't have to be best all the time. It's okay for good, okay? But just be doing something. Both of you be doing something devotional so that your growth should be in the same direction. Because if one of you is growing in your sanctification and the other one is stalled out because you're doing nothing, instead of growing together, you're beginning to grow in distance. You're beginning to grow apart, and that's going to be hard. So spiritually, when we're growing with this same trajectory, we're going to worship together. We're in the same sort of devotional pattern together. Our souls are growing together, and you should see more Christ in me day by day. Now again, there are days, there are seasons. Hopefully those seasons are short and they are measured in minutes, maybe days, maybe weeks, but hopefully not months or, heaven forbid, years, where you see less of Christ in me for whatever reason. It can be a physical thing, it can be a vocational thing, it can be a psychological thing, who knows. But in general, you should see more of Christ. I should look more like Christ to you now than I did 5 years ago. And if I don't look more like Christ to you, not to myself, there's a difference there. Do I look more like Jesus to you in the sense of how well I love you now than I did 5 years ago? And if the answer is no, okay, let's figure out why. Well, you're more irritable, you're more withholding, you're more, okay, we need to talk to somebody. We need to go see someone who can help us through whatever conflict or bitterness or whatever it is that's going on and get us back on the trajectory where grace, mercy, and love are evident in our lives as a couple. So worshiping together, growing together, praying for and with one another, but also serving together. Actually, in the same way that Olson originally nominated aesthetic intimacy, there's part of me that thinks there should be serving intimacy. Have you ever served with a group before? If it's going and doing visitation, if it's going and just working on a house, if it's serving in a food line somewhere, providing food for underprivileged people, you serve with someone, your heart grows towards that person. It just does so naturally. It's one of the reasons why especially churches and church staffs have to have really good boundaries to make sure that inappropriate connections don't begin to be made. Any place where you begin to get positive growth on any of these intimacies, then it's going to put pressure on the others to grow higher. That's a bit of a hack, but it's also a warning. We'll talk more about that when we talk about patterns here in just a little bit. So I think serving, it is I put it currently under spiritual intimacy because we should be Christians that serve together. That's part of what we do as we steward our time, our talent, and our treasure, is that we serve together. And it should connect us as a husband and wife as we serve together. But I think it might be its very own thing. So that's spiritual intimacy. And it provides the sort of basis for the others. And so if you're looking for a place to start and you're like, we aren't connecting, if you will start there and troubleshoot there, it should carry through to the others. If you start with physical intimacy, we're not having enough sex, or we're not doing well, or emotional intimacy, we don't have enough heart-to-heart conversations, that can be a hard place to start. But spiritual intimacy, let's make sure that we're in the Word together, we're growing together, we're praying for each other, we're serving together, we're worshiping and trying to be like the soul shepherds we're called to be together. That often gives the initial energy of connection that can then radically transform the rest of them. Physical intimacy. By physical intimacy, I mean both sexual and non-sexual physical intimacy. So if you could think about it, you all had those boxes up there. For physical intimacy, there should be a dotted line going down the middle. And on one side, it would be sexual intimacy. On the other side, it would be non-sexual physical intimacy. Now, for some guys, you say non-sexual physical intimacy, they're like, what is that? And I guarantee you their wives are saying, I can tell you what it is, you just won't listen, and you haven't been listening for 10 years. Every time I give you a kiss on the cheek, it's not an invitation, right? There is a way in which non-sexual physical intimacy is incredibly connective, especially for women. Men too, don't get me wrong, but especially for women. There's a neurotransmitter called oxytocin. Have you ever heard of oxytocin before? Yeah. Oxytocin they often call the cuddle hormone. And it's something that is deeply connective. Women get it in 3 instances, okay? They get it when they nurse, which is great. That way you won't kill this little being that's waking you up at 2 a.m. every single day. Now, ask a woman who's nursing at 2 a.m. and like, oh, do you feel like really No. I just feel like not killing it. Okay, great. It's working. Okay. The next time you get it in a little bit more intense dose, or a woman gets it in a little more intense dose, is non-sexual physical contact. Again, here's one of those questions for you to ask. What is the way in which your spouse likes non-sexual physical contact? My wife likes nothing more than to be able to lay her head on my chest while I play with her hair. If she was a cat, she would purr whenever I play with her hair. Some women hate that, right? It's like, do you know how much effort I put into this? You better keep your fingers away from it. Okay, fine. That's, again, totally fine. No big deal. But what is it? Some people like, hey, when you rub me on my back, I like to hold hands. I like hugs. Whatever it is, whatever that's non-sexual physical contact that creates that connection and releases that hormone. The third time, and again, it increases even more here, it's not as intense as it is for men, but it is post-orgasm. That is when a woman gets the biggest dose of this, and it's the only time men get it, which is why sexual physical intimacy is so important. It's why for as long as we've had the oldest profession that we know of, there have been prostitutes that will say, this John said, I love you, in whatever language they had. That makes no sense. You've just paid for this interaction. It's momentary, it's gone, and they are about to do that exact same thing with the next person who's willing to pay them. There is no loving thing going on here. And yet for men, because it's the only time we get the cuddle hormone, our brains are flooded with it post-orgasm. It's why men often feel so cuddly after they've had any sort of sexual interaction. And it gives a sort of emotional resilience. where it's easier to think well, and when there's a mistake made, it's fine, right? Versus beginning to go down the bitterness route of everything that happens is against me and frustrates me. And so sexual intimacy is part of the engine that drives connection rather than isolation. Men typically feel emotionally connected through sexual physical intimacy. Women often desire sexual physical intimacy through emotional intimacy. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. But there's a researcher in the mid 2000s by the name of Rosemary Basson. She was an OBGYN who studied female sexuality. And what we had done up until that point is we had looked at female sexuality from the same way and process that we talked about male sexuality. Most of that comes from a guy by the name of Kinsey. If you know anything about Kinsey, some of his methodology is really unfortunate, but he's probably the pioneer of sex and sexuality studies. So the whole field is gifted Kinseyan thoughts. And so one of those was that, okay, a female has the same sexual physical response as a man does, and therefore you're charting all the same sort of like orgasm response cycle, all that good stuff. And his thought was, hey, if you could just be really good in bed, if you could facilitate these arousal cycles under orgasm regularly, then you would want to have sex. That's the thought. And what Basson came and found is that a woman's desire for sexual contact mirrors their significant other from the time they are actually sexually active together. So if they're sexually active before they get married, the clock starts then, not after the wedding, and mirrors their partner's sexual appetite for somewhere between 6 months and 18 months. And then after that, somewhere in the 6 month to 18 month range, typically what you get is their sexuality and desire for sex runs through their emotional connection. If they feel very emotionally connected to their spouse, then they have a high desire for a physical expression of that emotional connection. So in the equation of women's sexuality, being really good in bed accounts for less than a third of a woman's desire to be sexually connected, which boggles most men's mind. What do you mean? If it's fun and enjoyable, why wouldn't you just want it? That's because the other 2/3 is carried by the emotional connection. If I feel emotionally connected, I desire physical connection. So sex is part of the engine, but for men, it's the opposite. As I feel sexually connected to you, I feel emotionally connected. I have that loving feeling towards you, which is why I get the sort of get those nominations of "I love you" from John's for as long as we've ever seen or have record. When it comes to sex and sexuality, we are called to be sexual stewards, not sexual consumers of one another. That's the framework I want people to be in when they think about sex and sexuality with their partner. We talk about stewardship, again, with time, talent, treasure. I think it's true about sexuality as well. And I think it's true not because it's just Josh, but because that seems to be what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 7. Don't withhold yourselves from each other except for a season of prayer. Why? And he wants you to be focused on the other because your body is not your own, but it's somebody else's. You are stewarding your body for somebody else. And so you want to be other focused as to your body. That doesn't mean no boundaries. It doesn't mean you're at the whim and bidding of somebody else. But it means that my goal in our relationship of sex and sexuality is to think about what they desire and where their appetite is and try to meet that as best as I am able, rather than to stand up for myself and what I want. Sexuality in the first century was odd. Notice, by the way, that Paul says husbands don't withhold. He starts with husbands, not wives. Isn't that weird? Well, that's because in the first century, women were considered the more sexually voracious of the genders. Yeah. What? That seems impossible to us. But it's true. In the first century, whether it was right or wrong, who knows? but they considered women to be more sexually active and more sexually voracious and have the stronger, more urgent sexual appetite than men did. In fact, if you were to audit all of the cases where people sued one another for sexual rights somebody was withholding, it was predominantly women suing men, not the other way around. And so Paul starts with men. Don't withhold yourself from your wife. Now, there's a lot of societal things going on there, but the turn is Victorian, right? Where Victoria was a queen who was never married, and therefore she couldn't have been sexually active, and so she kind of withheld any sense of sexual desire or appetite. And that influences even today the West, as we are post-Victorian. Women should enjoy sex and sexuality as much as men. That should just be true. But the way they enjoy sex and sexuality tends to be through emotional intimacy, not through physical intimacy, necessarily. Again, first 6 months to 18 months, it can be physically driven. And when I say this is averages. So we're talking like 2/3 to 3/4. If you're in the 1/3 to 1/4 of women who are have a high sexual appetite and it feels like a physical drive or need, awesome. Don't be ashamed about that. Emotional intimacy. Emotional intimacy is the sense that you get me. So oftentimes when I do premarital and we're talking about these various kinds of intimacy, and I talk about emotional intimacy, women immediately get it. They know what I'm talking about, and men are like, I think I know what we're talking about here, but I'm not real sure what we're talking about here. I get the word emotion, I get the word intimacy, you put them together, and it feels a little fuzzy. And so I've got an entire tool. Again, it's the same tool that I would tell you is my conflict tool that helps people to disclose thoughts and emotions and desires and to respond well. That's what I usually train people on. But it gives a sense of a pattern of how to be emotionally intimate. And emotionally intimate means that I can tell you what's going on in my heart. And you know what's going on in my heart. You know my joys. You know my fears. You know my hurts and my sadnesses. You know my boredoms. Even when they're the same hurts, frustrations, and fears that we've been dealing with for 35 years. It doesn't matter. I'm there with you. I don't roll my eyes. I don't get bored. I'm there for you and for your heart. Both men and women rank this high in desire. They desire to have relationships that are highly emotionally connected. But both men and women find women being better skilled at this. And so oftentimes men lean on their wives for any sense of emotional intimacy, and wives lean on their girlfriends for a sense of emotional intimacy. Because men are unskilled. Remember, we talked about time, focus, energy, and skill. There's a skill to giving someone the this and not this when it comes to what's going on in their hearts and being able to pay attention. That's another good question to ask. How is it that I respond in a way when you are trying to emotionally disclose where you feel received? By the way, when I talk about feeling, notice that I'm using these one-word descriptors of internal state. Hurt, sad, angry, blue, frustrated, annoyed, whatever it is. It's one word. You want a fun activity? Just a fun little piece of homework that you can do. It's not hard. Over the next week, listen for how many times you hear these two phrases. I feel like, and I feel that. Whatever comes after those two phrases, I feel like or I feel that, is a thought, not a feeling. Okay? No one ever says, I feel like happy. I feel that confused. People say things like, I feel like you should know how to pursue my heart. That's an assessment. That's a thought. What might come with that is frustration, hurt, sadness, loneliness, hopelessness, helplessness. Those are all feelings. But again, going back to that study where we tend to put more value in feelings rather than thoughts right now, for guys who tend to have a stunted emotional vocabulary because there's no playground in America where dudes are asking each other how they feel about that. Praise the Lord for it too. I'm not trying to make men go the other direction on this. Be good providers and protectors. Do it, right? But guys don't have a tendency to be like, I feel sad. No. Right? And so we don't often know how then to communicate in that way or pursue in that realm. And in order to appear competent, because we love competence, and because culture now has been inundated with it, we will say things like, I feel like, or I feel that, when really it's just another one of our thoughts, because we're good at knowing our thoughts. Again, there's good tools out there. I would point you to something called the Awareness Wheel. It's couples communication, talking and listening together. It's a little workbook about that big, very easy to make it through. If you're looking for practical skills on how to have good conflict and how to explore each other's hearts, it's like, I just need to know how to do it. Now, here's a warning. Any tool that you find, it doesn't matter if it's like men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Do y'all remember that? That it was like everybody loved that material in the 90s, you know. Whatever it is, it's going to feel dumb the first couple of times you do it because you've been talking and listening your whole lives. Who needs to teach you how to do it? Except if you don't feel like you can be emotionally connected, you're missing the skill portion of it, even if you're willing to have the time, the energy, and the focus. So don't not do it for lack of skill. Go out there and find the tool you need in order to be skilled emotional receivers and self-disclosers. Okay, recreational intimacy. This is the sort of intimacy that comes with just having fun together. There's a sort of connection that you get when you're able to go do something and have the emotional resonance of joy. Doesn't matter if it's going to a dinner and a movie, playing putt-putt, or bungee jumping. I would never bungee jump. That is not my sense of joy. I would have a heart attack on the way, and wherever I landed, there I would be buried. And that would be it. Okay? But whatever it is, it can be knitting, it can be playing bridge, it can be whatever joint activity in order that you might have joy together. Yesterday, Matt said something that was incredibly important. He said, always be dating your spouse. And that's hard. The more you get into it, the harder it is to continually date your spouse. And this is one of those elements where it's hard to continue to have recreational time together, especially once you start bringing home kids. And if, when you have kids, all of our time and energy is focused on the kids, it's hard to know what to do when the kids leave the home. All of a sudden, we're left with this relationship where it's like, I know it should probably be stronger than this. We've been together 20 years, and I'm not entirely sure what we even do together anymore. And you need to, and needs a strong word, but in this case, it's actually applicable. You need to be knowing what it is that your spouse wants to do that is recreational and restorative for them. For my wife, there's nothing better than a good book in a room by herself. And so sometimes just taking the kids and allowing her some quiet downtime is recreationally restorative for her. But we also need recreational time together. And she loves a good restaurant, just like I do. There's no doubt that I like a good meal and have never gone to a gym, right? So we really, I always tell people, close I get to a gym is when I drive by one. If you see me running, you should run too, because there's a bear chasing me. That's the only time you would ever see me run. And you don't have to be the fastest, just not the slowest. I'm okay with that for now. But we love going to good meals together. We like talking about ideas. We were at a dinner with a couple of kind of Christian thought leaders last week, and we were talking about our current society and our situation. One of those thought leaders, Alistair Roberts, is an in-depth thinker and expositor from the UK. And just the different cultures we find ourselves in this moment, and how we got here, and what's the way we get the gospel into the warp and woof of who we are by societies. We got done, and my wife and I began to take what we talked about to talk about it in our local context, in our church, and for her in her job. And it was a great conversation as we're on our way home from dinner. And as we walk in, and we're walking into the kids, right? They need baths and they need to get down for bedtime and all that good stuff. She gave me a kiss on the cheek with a big grin on her face, and she said, "Thanks for the recreational and intellectual intimacy." Right? It was a great time for us. We like that sort of thing, right? For others of you, you would have been bored to tears, right? And that's fine. There's no one size that fits all, except that you have to continue to find time to prioritize yourselves as a couple and to import the joy that you get with recreation. It's the thing that helps the marriage to feel like it's got life and light and air in it. When you're able to have that recreation and recreative activity together regularly. Again, if you've got young kids, and a couple of them, you're being crushed with finances and time and energy and all that good stuff. I mean, recreation may be a game of Yahtzee that you never finish. Who knows? But you've got to find some time, even if it's 10 or 15 minutes here or there, that it's just us and it's our joy resonating together, that we might feel connected together as a couple. This is easy when you're first together. It is kind of the thing that you rally around, is recreational intimacy. Let's go on dates together and get to know each other and go and do fun things together. But again, as life moves on, it gets pushed further and further and further down. And so you have to do what you can to make sure that it stays high. So this is another question for you. Another question to ask your spouse is, what is it that we do recreationally together? Maybe you can answer that like that, but maybe you struggle to think about what it is that we can do fun in our current state and stage of life. There is a questionnaire at the back of a book, His Needs, Her Needs. Anybody ever read His Needs, Her Needs? By the Harleys, I believe. It was a really popular book in the early 2000s. But there's an appendix that has like 200 possible extracurricular activities that you can do. It's like everything from card playing to horseback riding to whatever, you know? I mean, you guys are near a beach. You can do all sorts of fun things. I'm stuck in Columbia, South Carolina. There's nothing, right? I love Columbia, don't get me wrong. But we ain't got beach, we ain't got mountains. They're just 2 hours away in either direction. But you need to know, and if you're having trouble thinking, what is it in this phase and stage that we can do that's enjoyable together, you can go and find that appendix. You can just Google it, and you can find a PDF of that appendix that you can just print out or whatever, and you can just work through it. And you each look at it, and, you know, me, do I find this interesting? Yes, maybe, yes, maybe, no. And then you're looking for all the joint yeses and maybes to explore. Super helpful thing if you're having trouble finding ways to connect with each other recreationally. Okay, intellectual intimacy. Intellectual intimacy is the connection that comes from knowing my thought life or my mind. It can be complicated issues. It can be things like economics, politics, theology, education, right? It can be the Wall Street journalification of your marriage, where you want to talk about some expert idea, but it can also just be us talking about sports or the weather, and there's no right or wrong here. I was doing premarital with a couple recently, and I did this very thing. I drew this out for them, and I said, okay, I want you to rank and rate your various intimacies, what you find is the most connective for you, and what you would put on a scale of 1 to 10. And he put intellectual intimacy as number 1, and he gave it a 4. Right? She's just not as interested in talking about things like politics and theology. He was part of the debate club in high school and student government association in college, and he was like, and this guy is like, he's probably going to be a senator. So he's like, homecoming king and all this stuff for his school and at college. And he's just got a mind that loves to think about the implications of things like policy. Who wants to talk about that? He does. And she has not to this point had any sort of interest, and he knows that. But they're missing each other, and talking about this revealed for her in a way that felt painful at first, but was great. It revealed, okay, he wants more. He wants you to explore his mind. You don't have to have the same views. You don't have to have the same concerns. You don't have to love politics. You don't have to love theology. All you have to do is give this signal and not that signal. That's all you've got to do. And what does it mean? Again, a good question. What does it mean, especially if intellectual intimacy is really important for your spouse? What does it mean to give them this signal? And how much of this would they like? Couples get complacent here because you believe that your model of your spouse's mind is perfect. You've been together 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. You've already explored all the things. You've had all the conversations about what you believe politically and theologically, what you believe about sports, what you believe about child raising, what you believe about your parents and my parents, and all the things. We've had all the conversations you could ever imagine. And therefore, my model of you is static and perfect, except that you yourself change over time. Right? If you went and you polled yourself over the last 5 or 10 years, you would see some change. I'm not talking that you would go from a political liberal to conservative or vice versa, or all of a sudden you're libertarian, or who knows, maybe, but I'm not talking about that. But your mind will change on some issues. Maybe you think differently about child rearing, and therefore you think a little bit differently about your parents' rearing of you than you did 5 years ago. Maybe you think a little bit differently about society, a little bit different about theology, a little bit different about which sports team that you follow. I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan. Don't ask me. It's a long story, and it's a story full of pain and disappointment. And every year I reconsider whether or not I want to be a Minnesota Vikings fan. And I sign up for another year of pain, rejection, and disappointment. But I'm considering that. In my wife's mind, because she knows I love the Minnesota Vikings, she's just like, that's just a part of who he is. It's just static. And so it's easy to begin to create those models that feel static in the mind of your partner. And therefore, you have no need to continue to explore. But even if they're not changing, you want to find ways to ask what's going on in their thought world. Intellectual intimacy. Because knowing my mind feels a lot like knowing my soul. Imagine if God treated us this way. His model of us is perfect. It never is wanting. Imagine if he said, look, I know all of you, what you think, what you've done, so here's my answers in my book. Just go get it done. Why are you even wasting my time talking to me? But instead, he says, pray without ceasing. When it comes to talking and him listening, this is one of those things that just causes me to worship at times. Why would God listen to me? He's got all the knowledge, and he's given me all the answers in his book. The only reason he chooses to listen, and he tells me to always speak to him, he gives me all gas and no break when it comes to talking to him, is because he loves my voice. And he wants me to experience him loving and being loved by and being received by him. And so we want that same sort of reflection back to our partner, even if their mind isn't changing on something, when we give them the room to be explored and to be known in their thought life. Okay, let's quickly just look at patterns. I've mentioned most of these already. When all 5 are rated at a 7 or above, couples find their marriages connected and resilient. That is to say that the likelihood of an affair is extremely low when these are 7 and above. Affairs tend to happen with people who are less attractive than our spouses, which is weird, but it's true, or maybe as attractive, but very rarely, less than 10% of the time, are affairs with people who are more attractive than our spouse. Less than 10% of the time are affairs with someone we've known less than 6 months. So instead, affairs tend to be emotionally produced things. And for men, the number one emotion that produces affairs is esteem, and for women, it's empathy. And when we have resilient, connected marriages in all of those domains, when someone comes and esteems or has empathy, it's just kind of like, oh, okay, that was weird. Even if we've got some chemistry, that's fine. Why would I want to do anything with them? I've got this, and I really love and enjoy this. Instead, when we find our intimacy below a 7, and especially if it's below a 7 on many of those domains, we're open to just one person entering that orbit that promises connection, that promises you can be known and received well. And all of a sudden, it's like oxygen because you're made for it. And all of a sudden, something that you've been tamping down, that's a part of you you're designed to actually enjoy, feels like it's got a chance for expression. So we want all of those to be 7 or above in order to find ourselves resilient against any sort of infidelity. Like I said, physical and emotional intimacies are the most vulnerable, which means the most painful to mess up, but they're also the most effective for creating connections. Again, that's both a hack in the sense of, like, if you want to make sure that you don't end up in inappropriate relationships with others, then you are going to limit any sort of emotional disclosure with anybody that you are not married to, or that isn't like a same-sex friend or something like that. But anybody who is opposite gendered and close in age to you, you're going to shut down emotional intimacy, because emotional intimacy leads to a desire for physical intimacy. It can also be the thing that, again, you use, okay, my wife and I aren't feeling emotionally connected. Let's find a way to be emotionally connected, and it should yield a lot of physical and other kind of emotional connection. If you're at the place where emotional and physical intimacy feel a little too overwhelming, they feel a little too vulnerable, then recreational and intellectual intimacy are often less vulnerable, easier ways to jumpstart. So let's just imagine you are now ranking and rating your intimacies, and what you find is that the ones that are most important to you, either emotional or physical, tend to be at a 5 or below. And you're thinking, we need to jumpstart this. Well, just deciding to get in bed together a bunch, probably not going to help, right? Whole bunch of really heart-disclosing conversations probably isn't going to help a whole bunch right then without some skill that goes with it. And so oftentimes that spiritual intimacy, but also that recreational and intellectual intimacy, are ways to start building that sort of connection that lead more organically to the ability to be emotionally and physically connected. Here's some application, and I've already mentioned this. Was there a time in your life where you felt your connection to your spouse was at its deepest and most abiding? When was that? Describe it. What was it like for you? What was going on? Oftentimes it's like in that infatuation, like you were writing me poetry. And you were like, you wanted to be around me all the time, Right. Expressions of emotional care and desire. And the sort of time, energy, and focus that said, you're what my entire world revolves around. No wonder we felt connected. Can we get back to some of that? And then which of these intimacy do you desire most? Which does your spouse desire most? On a scale of 1 to 10, how intimately connected do I feel in each of these? Same thing for your spouse. Again, I would tell you, take spiritual intimacy off the table. We're good Christians. We're going to say that's the most important. I'm going to put this back up there. Take spiritual off. You've got those 4. Rank them 1 to 4. The 1 is the one that is most connective for me. It doesn't matter if you guys are different. In fact, more than likely you will be. And no type of intimacy is an unimportant type of intimacy. Okay? You're just trying to say 1, 2, 3, 4. This is my pattern for right now. And then you rate them 1 to 10. This is how connected I feel. 10, could not be more connected. 1, I barely know you're there. And you're trying to give it that sort of rating. And every time you begin to feel like you're moving in disconnected ways, do it again. Look at that thing, re-rank and re-rate, because in various times of life, those rankings change. Recreational intimacy was never more important for my wife and I than when we had little bitty children and we could never go out together. Because our time was dominated, especially when we had 4 kids, 5 and under. Oh my gosh. Do you know how hard it is to get babysitters that want to come and watch 4 kids, 5 and under? And we didn't have family in town. And so we just barely got time to go out and to do anything fun together. And so all of a sudden, the recreational intimacy would generally be like number 3 for us. It became number 1 because it was just so rare. So these patterns can change, and you're trying to figure out what is the pattern for our relationship right now, and where am I looking to deploy my energy for you rather than using my energy to stand up for me, right? So I'm not saying you come meet me where I need you. I'm saying I'm willing to meet you wherever you need me. All right, let me close us in prayer.